The transport shuttle tore through the violet sky of Creon 9, leaving a streak of ionized frost behind it as it descended toward the ice-crusted valley below. Inside the cargo bay, the cadets of the Galactic Survival Academy sat in silence, wrapped in their metallic training suits that offered little comfort against the cold they were about to face. The air inside the craft was dry, almost sterile, yet the tension made it feel heavy. The cadets came from a dozen different species: scaled dravicans from the volcanic worlds, feathered Iskari from the high-altitude colonies, and translucent Kliss from aquatic planets where warmth was constant and comforting. None of them were built for this. Only one remained quietly calm, Elena Cross, the lone human among them. She sat apart, her helmet resting in her lap, eyes fixed on the shimmering landscape through the window. To her, this was not fear, it was curiosity. Humans had always been drawn to places where others turned away. When the shuttle's landing struts touched down, the shockwave rippled across the frozen plain, sending cracks racing across the surface like spider webs. The rear hatch opened, and a blast of icy air swept inside, instantly frosting the inner walls. One by one, the cadets stepped out, boots crunching against the brittle layer of ice. Their breaths turned into crystals that hung briefly in the air before vanishing. Elena stepped out last, her visor dimming automatically against the blinding light reflected from the endless field of snow. The planet stretched in every direction like an ocean frozen mid-wave, sharp ridges of ice, half-buried boulders, and distant mountains that seemed to hover in mist. The temperature display on her wrist unit flashed, 54 degrees. The instructor, a tall four-armed being from the Ja'ari species, stood on a nearby ridge and addressed the group through the comms. His voice, filtered through the translator, was deep and metallic. "Cadets, your assignment is simple in words, but cruel in practice. You will remain on this surface for 7 cycles. No artificial heat, no power cells, no plasma ignition. Survive with what this planet offers." A chorus of complaints immediately rose from the group, some angry, others panicked. The instructor ignored them. "Your suits will deactivate heating functions in 1 hour. Gather what you can. Build shelter. Find sustenance. The weak will call for evacuation. The capable will learn." Then he tapped his wrist, and the shuttle lifted off, vanishing into the dim sky, leaving only a column of frost swirling in its wake. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the groaning of distant glaciers and the occasional crack of expanding ice. The cadets turned toward each other, blinking through frozen visors, their minds racing. "No fire!" hissed a scaled Dravican named Kor, his breath visible even through the armor gaps. "No heat source. How do we eat? How do we live?" An Iskari female, feathers ruffled against the cold, responded bitterly. "We don't. That's the lesson. The Academy wants to see how fast we freeze." The group began shouting ideas, building wind shelters, digging pits, conserving energy, but the panic in their voices betrayed the truth. None of them knew what to do. Eleanor listened quietly, crouched near the snow, running her gloved fingers through the crystalline powder. Beneath the top layer, she felt something denser, heavier, frozen soil mixed with stone. She chipped at it with a small tool from her belt and noticed faint vapors escaping through tiny cracks in the ground. She narrowed her eyes. Warm air. The planet wasn't dead. It was breathing. Somewhere below, geothermal vents were alive, exhaling faint heat through the fractures. She looked up, scanning the horizon for distortions, and saw small waves in the air, like invisible heat dancing above certain ridges. She smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped even further. The group scattered to find shelter, each cadet moving with desperation. Some dug into snowbanks, others attempted to build crude domes from ice slabs. The Iskari tried to form a nest out of compacted snow, but her feathers stiffened, turning brittle from frost. Kor, the Dravican, hammered stones together, shouting curses as his thick fingers grew numb. Elena, instead of joining them, began gathering small rocks, clay-like soil fragments, and lengths of vine frozen under the surface. Her movements were calm, deliberate, almost methodical. She knew the others thought she was wasting energy, but she didn't care. She had seen humans survive deserts, oceans, voids of space. Fire was not the only way to find warmth. Hours passed, and darkness swallowed the landscape. The twin moons of Creon 9 cast pale light over the valley, revealing the cadets curled in makeshift shelters. The wind howled across the open plains, carrying sharp grains of ice that sliced through thin fabrics. Eleanor worked silently, constructing a shallow pit and lining it with flat stones. She stacked clay fragments around it, forming a narrow trench that curved like a serpent. The air vents beneath the ground whispered faintly, sending occasional bursts of warmth upward. She placed one of her ration bars above the vent as an experiment. After several minutes, it softened. The warmth was real, and it was steady. Her heart quickened. By midnight, she had gathered enough material to create a small dome over the vent. She weaved vines between clay pieces, sealing them with frost-hardened mud. When the structure was complete, she crawled inside. The air was warmer, not by much, but enough to stop her hands from shaking. She leaned against the inner wall, exhausted, yet satisfied. Her breath no longer crystallized instantly. She pressed her palm against the stones and felt the pulse of heat beneath them, rhythmic like a heartbeat. Nature had given her a loophole, and she had answered with creativity. Outside, the cries of shivering cadets echoed through the night. One begged for emergency extraction, another cursed the academy. Eleanor closed her eyes, forcing herself not to intervene. She had to prove that intelligence was more than defiance. It was endurance. Still, the guilt crept in as she imagined their pain. She tore a section of her emergency blanket and spread it across the top of her dome to trap more heat. She whispered softly into the darkness, "Tomorrow, I'll help them too. But first, I need to survive tonight." The ground trembled slightly, and a low rumble passed beneath her shelter. It was the planet's inner breath again, steady, ancient, alive. She listened to it like a lullaby. The air inside her dome smelled faintly of minerals and damp soil, not the sterile cold of the surface. Her mind drifted to Earth, to stories of early explorers who used the land itself as a furnace. Humanity had always done the impossible, not by breaking rules, but by bending them. As she drifted to sleep, she knew one thing for certain: the test would not defeat her. By morning, she would find a way to make this frozen world feed her, warm her, and remind the galaxy why humans were feared not for their strength, but for their endless resourcefulness. The first pale rays of Creon 9's twin suns spread slowly across the frozen horizon, turning the endless plains of ice into a mirror of cold fire. Eleanor stirred beneath her dome of clay and vine, her body stiff and her breath heavy, but the air around her was still faintly warm. She pressed her hand to the inner wall, feeling a pulse of heat rising through the stones she had placed the night before. The geothermal vent beneath the ground breathed steadily like a living thing, exhaling warmth in waves. For the first time since arriving, she felt something close to comfort. But comfort was temporary. Survival demanded more than endurance. The warmth she'd captured could keep her alive, but it could also be the seed of something greater. She knew the trial wasn't about obedience, it was about innovation. The rules said, no fire, but they didn't forbid heat. The difference was everything. Eleanor crawled out of the dome, her visor fogging as she met the biting air. The temperature outside bit into her exposed fingers before the gloves sealed again. Around her, the landscape stretched silent and empty. The cadets' makeshift shelters lay scattered across the plain like forgotten relics. Several had already collapsed in the night. She spotted Kor, the scaled Dravican, crouched beside a shattered ice barrier, his breath ragged. His once glimmering scales had dulled to a pale grey, a sign of near hypothermia for his species. A few meters away, the Askari girl sat motionless, her feathered body tucked under broken armor plates. The others barely moved, conserving energy or sinking toward unconsciousness. Elena's jaw tightened. The thought of watching them die in silence twisted her gut. But she had to move carefully. Help too soon, and she'd lose her own strength. She turned her attention back to her structure. The dome held together better than expected. Overnight, the frost had sealed its outer layer into a glassy crust, making it almost airtight. Inside, condensation had formed small droplets on the ceiling, proof that heat retention worked. She removed her small toolkit and inspected the vent's position. The thermal draft was strong but uneven, releasing waves of heat at irregular intervals. If she could channel it more effectively, she could raise the temperature inside enough to cook or dry supplies, without fire, without breaking the rule. Her mind began to map designs from memory, old blueprints she had studied from Earth's ancient survival manuals, stories of people who built smokeless stoves using nothing but clay and air. Humans had learned long ago to tame nature's breath without flame. Now she had to do the same here, on a world where fire itself was forbidden. She began by marking the area around the vent with stones, shaping a narrow trench that curved into 2 branching tunnels. Using her multi-tool, she carved small air channels from compressed clay, stacking them in layers to guide the rising heat. Each movement was slow and deliberate. Her fingers numbed every few minutes, forcing her to warm them against her chest. The cold gnawed at her joints, but her focus burned bright. The process felt almost meditative. Each stroke of her tool, each adjustment of angle, brought her closer to something functional. By midday, she had created a rough prototype, a pit draft stove made entirely of native material, drawing air from the ground and circulating it through the dome. She leaned over the opening and felt a faint stream of warm air brush her face. It worked, barely, but it worked. In the distance, Kor stumbled toward her, dragging a half-frozen limb. His voice cracked through the comms. "Human, what are you doing?" She looked up without pausing. "Making the cold work for us." He laughed weakly, his teeth chattering. "You're wasting energy. This planet kills ingenuity first." She ignored his words, though she felt a twinge of pity. He was proud, but fear had dulled his pride into bitterness. She handed him a chunk of thawed stone. "Hold this near the vent." When he obeyed, his hand flinched. The warmth startled him. His reptilian pupils widened. "This is from the ground." She nodded. "The planet breathes. You just have to listen." He crouched beside her, fascinated but exhausted. For a few minutes, silence stretched between them, broken only by the rumble of the vent below. She studied his trembling hands. "You won't survive another night like this," she said quietly. "Bring the others here if you can. We'll need more hands." He hesitated, then nodded slowly before turning back toward the other cadets. She watched him go, his heavy steps cracking the frost with each movement, and then returned to her work. As the day progressed, the wind picked up, carrying a low, mournful howl that echoed through the valley. The dome shuddered, and flakes of frost drifted down. Eleanor reinforced it with more clay and vines, sealing the cracks with a layer of melted ice that refroze almost instantly. The cold fought her with every motion, but she kept going until her muscles burned. By dusk, her structure had grown from a crude shelter into a complex network of vents and chambers. The main dome now had 2 narrow tunnels leading outward, forming an airflow cycle that trapped heat while venting cold air. It was primitive engineering, yet elegant in its simplicity, a human signature written in clay. When the second night fell, the cadets began to return. Kor came first, carrying the Askari girl over his shoulder, her feathers limp and covered in frost. Behind him staggered a few more, a pair of amphibian twins, one of them barely conscious. None spoke, their eyes fixed on the faint mist rising from Eleanor's dome. It was not smoke, but condensation, proof of warmth, of life. She gestured toward the entrance. "Inside, quickly." They hesitated, wary of traps, but desperation overcame pride. One by one, they crawled through the narrow opening. The heat hit them instantly, not hot, but shockingly gentle after the freezing air outside. Steam coiled faintly in the corners, carrying the earthy scent of clay. Elena followed last, sealing the entrance behind her with a layer of vines. Inside, the air shimmered faintly. The stones she had arranged glowed with a soft radiance from the trapped heat. Kor sank to the ground with a sigh that sounded almost like gratitude. The Askari girl tucked her head beneath her wing, trembling as warmth seeped into her body. The twins lay side by side, breathing shallowly but evenly. Elena crouched near the vent, adjusting the angle of a clay plate to guide more air through. The system hummed softly like a creature purring in sleep. She pressed her palm to the wall and whispered, "Good. Keep breathing." The group watched her in silence, their expressions shifting from suspicion to awe. Finally, Kor spoke, his voice low. "You've done what no one thought possible without flame." She looked up, sweat glistening on her forehead. "Fire is a tool. Heat is a language. You just have to learn how to speak it." His scaled lips curled into something close to a smile. For a moment, the harsh divide between species melted away. In this fragile bubble of warmth, there was no hierarchy, no academy, no trial, only life clinging to life. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Winds screamed across the plain, lifting sheets of snow that buried half the remaining shelters. The dome quivered, but held. Inside, the cadets shared silent gratitude. Elena leaned back, her eyes half closed, listening to the rhythm of the vent beneath her feet. The hum had become steady now, almost like a heartbeat in sync with her own. She felt her exhaustion settle deep into her bones, but she smiled anyway. The trial had only just begun, yet something had already changed. She had turned an impossible command into a challenge, and a challenge into creation. As she drifted toward uneasy sleep, she thought of what would come next. A warm shelter was only the beginning. Tomorrow, she would find a way to make it feed them too. The storm outside had raged through the night, but when the first light crept through the cracks in the dome, it carried a pale gold hue instead of the cold blue of the previous mornings. The air was still heavy with frost, but inside the shelter, the temperature had risen enough that water droplets clung to the inner walls. Elena opened her eyes slowly, her body aching from the hard ground, but her chest filled with a quiet sense of victory. The warmth she had nurtured hadn't vanished overnight. It had grown stronger. The hum beneath her palms was steadier now, the vent beneath the dome fully alive, as if the planet itself had decided to help her. She sat up carefully, brushing dust and bits of dried clay from her uniform, and turned her attention to the cadets still sleeping around her. Kor lay sprawled near the vent, his breathing deep and even, his scales glistening faintly again. The Askari girl slept curled up like a hatchling, her feathers rising and falling with each breath. For the first time since landing on this frozen planet, no one looked close to dying. Elena crawled to the entrance and pushed a small opening through the layer of vines. A rush of cold air swept in, sharp enough to make her flinch. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried under snowdrifts and ice ridges that sparkled like crystal shards. The Academy's distant observation drones floated overhead, their blue lights scanning the terrain, recording every movement for later analysis. Somewhere, the instructors were watching, waiting to see who broke the rules or begged for evacuation. She almost smiled at the thought. If they saw her little dome and assumed she'd cheated, they wouldn't understand until they looked closer. She hadn't broken the rules. She had rewritten them. She stepped outside, her boots sinking into the soft crust. The sunlight reflected blindingly off the white plains. Her suit's sensors flickered to life, registering minimal radiation and breathable air for short durations. She lowered her visor for a moment and inhaled deeply, the air crisp and thin, but real. Hunger clawed at her stomach. The others would wake soon, and if they were to survive another day, they needed food. Her last ration bar was gone, and the others had likely exhausted theirs as well. She scanned the horizon, focusing on a patch of faint vegetation near a series of cracks in the ice. If the vent systems ran through the ground, then some plant life could be feeding off the geothermal warmth. That was where she would begin. Eleanor returned to the dome briefly, kneeling beside Core and tapping his shoulder. His eyes opened instantly, pupils narrowing against the light. "Stay inside and keep the vent stable," she said firmly. "If the airflow reverses, you'll suffocate. Keep the secondary tunnel open." He grunted in acknowledgement, too tired to argue. The others barely stirred, and she didn't wake them. It was better if she worked alone for now. Fewer questions, fewer mistakes. She checked her toolkit, adjusted the heat-insulated gloves, and set out across the frozen field. The silence outside was immense, the kind that pressed against the mind like weight. Her boots left deep imprints in the snow as she moved toward the ridge. Every sound, the crunch of her steps, the distant creak of shifting ice, felt amplified by the emptiness. She reached the cracked section of the ground after half an hour of careful climbing. Steam escaped in lazy spirals from the fissures, and the ground was softer there, tinted greenish by mineral deposits. Kneeling, she brushed away layers of frost until she uncovered clusters of translucent moss clinging to the rock. She touched it gently. It was warm, pulsing faintly, alive. A primitive life form, perhaps feeding on minerals and heat. She carefully scraped a handful into a small metal container. It smelled faintly of salt and iron, unpleasant but edible if boiled. As she worked, she noticed movement in the distance, a flicker of motion among the ice pillars. Her hand went instinctively to the tool strapped to her belt. For a moment she thought it might be a malfunctioning drone, but then the shadow shifted again, moving low and fast. Her pulse quickened. A native life form, maybe hunting the heat from the vent fields. She crouched, trying to see through the glare. A shape emerged from behind an icy ridge, a quadruped creature with translucent skin and a mane of luminous threads running along its spine. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, its elongated head turning toward her as if sensing her heartbeat. She froze completely. The creature studied her in silence before lowering its head to sniff at the steam vent nearby. When it exhaled, vapor clouded the air between them. She slowly reached for a fragment of moss and tossed it toward the vent, hoping to distract it. The creature sniffed it once, then turned away, gliding over the snow with unsettling grace. Only after it disappeared into the mist did she release her breath. This planet was not empty. It was merely sleeping under its frozen mask. When she returned to the dome, her gloves were stiff with frost, and her muscles trembled from exhaustion. Core was awake and had managed to reinforce the inner tunnel as instructed. The others sat upright now, weak but alert. The Askari girl looked up, her feathers fluffed out again. "Food?" she asked softly, her voice cracked from dryness. Elena nodded and knelt beside the vent, placing the metal container on a flat stone. She adjusted the clay plates to redirect airflow, trapping the hottest current beneath the surface. Soon, the moss began to release moisture, the liquid sizzling faintly as it heated. A faint, earthy aroma filled the dome. It wasn't pleasant, but it smelled alive. Core watched in disbelief. "You're cooking," he said, his tone halfway between awe and accusation. Eleanor didn't look up. "I'm using heat transfer, not flame. The rule forbids combustion, not chemistry." The amphibian twins blinked in unison, their translucent eyelids twitching. One whispered, "You're bending nature itself." She smiled faintly. "No, just listening to it." When the moss mixture was ready, she divided it into small portions and passed them around. The cadets hesitated at first, but soon gave in to hunger. The taste was bitter, metallic, but it warmed their throats and filled their stomachs. A flicker of color returned to their faces. Core exhaled deeply, steam curling from his mouth. "You're strange, human," he muttered. "You find warmth in death and food in rock." She shrugged. "That's how we survived our own ice ages." The dome filled with the soft sound of breathing, the rhythm of life returning. Outside, the wind began to rise again, though softer now, like a whisper instead of a scream. Elena leaned against the wall, exhaustion creeping up on her. Her plan worked, but it wasn't enough. Food would run out quickly. Tomorrow, she needed something sustainable. Roots, fungus, perhaps even small creatures feeding off the vents. Her mind never stopped calculating. Every variable mattered: air pressure, soil composition, the distance between vents. She would build more tunnels, redirect airflow to form multiple heat pockets, maybe even a small greenhouse. It was madness, but it was possible. As she watched the others drift into uneasy rest, she realized how much had changed in 2 days. Fear had turned into reliance. They no longer looked at her as the fragile outsider. They looked at her as the center of their fragile hope. It was a burden she hadn't asked for, but one she couldn't reject. She was human. Adaptation was her inheritance. The rules of the academy didn't matter anymore. The real test wasn't about who followed the orders. It was about who learned to live when the universe said they shouldn't. The last light of day faded behind the frozen hills, painting the sky in colors of copper and violet. Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metal badge, the emblem of the academy. The edge had cracked from the cold. She turned it over in her hand and whispered, "If you're watching, mark this in your report. Humanity doesn't just survive. Humanity rebuilds." Then she placed the badge near the vent where the heat could reach it. The metal glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light of her creation, the first breath of warmth in a world that had never known fire. By the following morning, the dome no longer felt like a temporary refuge. It had become something alive, breathing softly with the rhythm of the geothermal vents beneath it. The faint hum that once sounded mechanical now pulsed like a heartbeat through the clay floor. Elena woke to the sound of dripping water as condensation rolled down the inner walls into small puddles. The air smelled faintly of earth and minerals instead of frozen dust, and the temperature was almost tolerable without her helmet's thermal seal. She stretched carefully, her muscles aching from the endless strain, and then she pushed herself up. Around her, the others still slept, bundled close to the vent where the air was warmest. Kor's chest rose and fell slowly, the dull gleam of his scales returning to their natural blue tone. The Askari girl twitched in her sleep, her feathers rustling like dry leaves. For a moment, Elena simply watched them and realized something quietly miraculous. No one was dying anymore. The cold had been pushed back, if only within these fragile walls. She stepped out into the pale light beyond the dome. The sun hung low, filtered through a haze of ice crystals that painted the horizon in soft orange. The storm had buried much of the landscape under new snow, reshaping the terrain into a field of rolling hills. The air was still brutal, but Elena no longer flinched at its bite. Her body had begun to adjust, her mind too. She had stopped thinking in terms of comfort and started thinking in systems: pressure, heat, flow, balance. Everything was interconnected. Every change she made to the dome affected how the vents breathed, how the air circulated, and even how the others slept. Her survival had become an act of design. Today, she had one goal: expand the shelter into something sustainable. The vent beneath the dome could support more than just warmth. It could sustain growth. The moss she had found the day before had shown that this planet's life could adapt to geothermal energy. If she could use that to cultivate something edible, even crude vegetation, it would free them from scavenging and rationing. But to do that, she needed to expand the vent network, guide the heat to new pockets without collapsing the structure. It would be delicate work, and one mistake could flood the dome with toxic gas or smother the vent entirely. Still, it was a risk she was willing to take. She knelt near the outer wall and began carving through the hardened clay, widening one of the side tunnels. The cold bit through her gloves as she worked, but her hands moved with practiced rhythm. Each scrape of her tool sent sparks of pain through her fingers, yet she didn't stop. After an hour of steady work, she reached a thin layer of brittle rock. Beneath it, she could feel vibrations, another vent, smaller than the main one, but close enough to connect. She took a deep breath, pressed her ear to the ground, and listened. The hum below was steady but faint, like a whisper waiting to be heard. She smiled slightly. She could work with this. Core emerged from the dome, blinking against the brightness. His breath turned to mist as he spoke. "You're expanding again," he muttered. She nodded, not looking up. "We'll need more air circulation soon. The dome can't handle the moisture buildup." He frowned, clearly worried. "If you open another vent, you could release poison." She paused, then looked at him with calm certainty. "Or life." The argument ended there. He knew better than to challenge her when her mind was set. He grumbled something in his own language and began gathering stones to reinforce the tunnel entrance. It was a small gesture, but it meant trust. Hours passed as they worked together in silence. The snow outside glistened under the weak sunlight, and occasionally a gust of wind swept across the plains, carrying with it faint vibrations from somewhere deep in the ice. Perhaps the planet's tectonic size, or distant creatures moving beneath. Eleanor barely noticed. Her focus was absolute. She connected the tunnel to the smaller vent with painstaking precision, sealing cracks with clay and layering stone along the inner walls to control airflow. When the last barrier broke, a soft plume of steam rose from the opening, warm and clean. She exhaled slowly. The expansion had succeeded. When she returned inside, the others looked up in silent anticipation. The air was warmer already, the dome now breathing more evenly as heat spread through both tunnels. Moisture condensed faster, dripping steadily into the puddle she had carved into a basin. The Askari girl watched with fascination. "The air sings now," she said softly, her feathers shimmering faintly in the diffused light. Eleanor tilted her head. "That's the sound of survival." She set down her tools, grabbed the small container of moss samples, and examined them. Most were still intact, their color deepening slightly from the constant warmth. She broke one piece apart and examined the interior. Tiny spores glowed faintly, feeding on the minerals in the vent's vapor. It was a kind of symbiotic life, a perfect base for cultivation. She placed several pieces of moss near the new vent opening, pressing them gently into the clay where moisture collected. Within hours, the heat caused condensation to drip over them, forming a damp patch of green that slowly began to spread. It wasn't food yet, but it was growth, a promise. Core watched her carefully, his heavy brow furrowed. "You plan to farm?" he asked. She nodded. "We'll start small. The planet is giving us warmth and water. Now it's time we give it life back." The others didn't fully understand, but they didn't question her anymore. The human who had once been an outsider was now their leader by necessity, not authority. She moved among them, teaching them how to monitor airflow, how to patch cracks with melted frost, how to read the temperature fluctuations by sound. Even the youngest cadet among them, a quiet amphibian male, learned to sense the rhythm of the vent's breathing. Together, they transformed the dome from a desperate shelter into a living habitat. By the end of the day, Eleanor sat near the main vent, exhausted but content. The air shimmered gently around her, the warmth seeping into her bones. She took a sip of the condensed water from the basin. It tasted faintly metallic but clean enough to drink. The moss had begun to root deeper into the clay, spreading faster than she expected. The Askari girl approached her quietly, kneeling beside her. "You changed this place," she said in a hushed tone. "It feels like it belongs to us now." Eleanor looked up at the curved walls glowing faintly in the dim light and smiled. "No, it belongs to the planet. We're just learning how to live with it." As night fell, the storm returned, softer this time, but relentless. The wind howled across the plains, and the ice moaned in long, echoing notes. The dome trembled, but the walls held firm. Inside, the group huddled close, surrounded by warmth and the faint scent of growing moss. Eleanor lay awake, her eyes fixed on the small patch of green near the vent. It glowed faintly in the dark, a beacon of life against death's silence. She thought of the instructors watching from orbit, of the data streaming to their consoles, temperatures, heart rates, atmospheric readings, and she wondered what they would think when they realized the human cadet had not only survived, but created something new. Sleep came slowly, but it was peaceful. The hum of the vents lulled her into dreams of worlds like this one, frozen, hostile, waiting for someone brave enough to listen to their heartbeat. When she finally drifted off, the moss beside the vent shimmered brighter, releasing faint particles into the air. Unseen by anyone, the spores began to multiply, feeding on warmth and moisture, turning the dead planet's breath into fertile air. And for the first time in centuries, Creon 9 began to remember what life felt like. When Elena woke again, it was not the cold that stirred her, but the sound of quiet voices and the soft dripping of water. The air inside the dome was thick and humid now, filled with a low murmur that came from the two vents breathing in perfect rhythm. She blinked in the dim, diffused light and sat up slowly. The green moss that had once covered only a small corner had spread like wildfire overnight. Its bioluminescence glowed faintly across the clay walls, painting the dome in hues of emerald and gold. For a moment she simply stared, her heart racing. What had begun as an experiment had turned into something much larger, a living ecosystem born from warmth, patience, and stubborn human will. The air smelled cleaner too, richer, almost sweet. She touched the moss gently, feeling its warmth pulse beneath her fingertips. It was alive in every sense of the word. Kor was already awake, crouched near the vent and watching the growth in silence. His scaled face reflected the green light like carved glass. When he noticed her stirring, he looked up. "It grew," he said quietly. "Overnight." She nodded, her throat tight with disbelief. "It's feeding on the minerals in the vapor. The heat accelerates its metabolism." He reached out a clawed hand, but hesitated before touching it. "It feels wrong," he murmured. "This planet was never meant to breathe life again." She shook her head. "Every planet wants to live, Kor. Some just need a reason." The Askari girl approached, her feathers shimmering faintly under the glow. She knelt beside the wall and pressed her palm against the moss. Her eyes widened. "It's warm," she whispered. "It's alive." Eleanor nodded again, her mind already racing ahead. If the moss could thrive like this, it could produce oxygen and maybe even nutrients. With more time, it might evolve or attract microlife. She stood and began to check the structural integrity of the dome. The new heat distribution had softened some of the clay, but the walls still held. The balance was delicate, but stable. By midday, the dome had become almost tropical compared to the frozen world outside. Condensation rolled down the walls, pooling in the stone basin she had carved days earlier. Eleanor collected the water, noticing a faint green tint. It was infused with spores from the moss, rich in minerals and perhaps even amino compounds. It might not only sustain them, but strengthen them. When she took a sip, the taste was earthy and slightly bitter, but she felt a rush of warmth spread through her chest. "Drink," she said, handing the basin to the others. They obeyed without hesitation. For the first time, no one complained about the flavor. The warmth alone was enough to make it precious. Later that day, a sound shattered the calm, a mechanical hum descending from above. Everyone looked up sharply. Through the narrow entrance of the dome, Elena saw a shadow cross the snow outside, followed by a flicker of blue light. A drone. The academy was back. The instructors had returned to retrieve the survivors and record the results. She felt her stomach twist. Part of her had waited for this moment, but another part recoiled from it. The world beyond her dome seemed cold again, unfamiliar and cruel. She had built something living here, something fragile and pure, and now it would be dissected, measured, and labeled. The drone hovered near the entrance, scanning the structure with beams of light. The air shimmered as it registered the heat signatures inside. Eleanor stepped forward and pushed the vines aside, allowing the machine a clear view. "Elena Cross, human cadet," a metallic voice said through the translator. "Trial duration, 7 cycles complete. Status, survival confirmed. You are to prepare for extraction. The others looked at her in silence, waiting for her reaction. She turned toward them, her face unreadable. Pack what you need, she said softly. We're leaving soon. But her hands trembled as she spoke. While the others gathered their few belongings, she moved to the vent and crouched beside it. The moss had begun to emit tiny spores into the air, shimmering like floating dust in the green light. The dome was alive in a way no report could ever capture. She traced a finger through the spores, watching them swirl. For a moment, she wondered what would happen if she refused to leave. The thought was irrational, dangerous even, but it lingered. She could stay, nurture this small paradise, and turn Creon 9 into something new. But she wasn't here as a colonist or a dreamer. She was a cadet, a human representing her species in a galaxy that doubted it belonged among the stars. Her duty was to show what humanity could do, and she had done that. When the extraction craft landed hours later, the ground shook softly, scattering frost into the air. The dome's walls quivered as the wind from the engines swept across the plain. The hatch opened with a hiss, revealing the tall figure of the Ja'ari instructor framed in the metallic light. His many eyes glowed faintly as he surveyed the dome. "Cadet Cross," he said, his voice low and resonant. "We observed your progress. You violated no rules, yet the data shows atmospheric changes inconsistent with the planet's natural state. Explain." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "I used the geothermal vents. I built a passive thermal circulation system. The growth is a result of that." He studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "You did not light fire, but you ignited something else." He stepped inside, his breath fogging the air. The green light from the moss reflected in his eyes as he examined the interior. "You changed the air composition," he said. "You introduced life." His tone carried no accusation, only quiet awe. "You understand what that means?" She nodded. "It means survival isn't defiance, it's creation." The instructor inclined his head slightly. "Then you have passed." He turned toward the others. "All of you have." Relief washed over the group, but it was subdued. No one cheered. The dome had become their world. Leaving it felt like abandoning something sacred. As the group prepared to depart, Elena lingered one last time near the vent. She pulled a small sample of moss from the wall and sealed it in a transparent vial, tucking it into her uniform pocket. A fragment of Creon 9 would come with her. The rest she left behind, knowing it would continue to grow. The shuttle rose into the pale sky, the frozen landscape shrinking beneath them. From the viewport, Eleanor watched as the green glow of the dome faded into the distance, then disappeared entirely under the snowstorm's veil. The planet looked dead again, silent and cold. But she knew better. Beneath that surface, life had begun to stir. The spores would spread through the cracks and vents, carried by the planet's own breath. In weeks, perhaps months, the frost would shift, and the first patches of green would bloom in defiance of extinction. Back aboard the Academy's orbital station, the instructors debriefed the survivors. Reports were written, data collected, rules re-examined. Some questioned the ethical implications of altering a planet's environment. Others called it evolution. Elena said little. When asked what lesson she had learned, she answered simply, that warmth doesn't come from fire, it comes from understanding. Weeks later, when the instructors reviewed the satellite data of Creon 9, something unexpected appeared. The geothermal regions pulsed faintly with heat and chlorophyll signatures far stronger than predicted. The moss had multiplied beyond control, spreading through vent networks across hundreds of kilometers. A planet once barren was beginning to breathe again. In her quarters, Eleanor stood by the viewport, staring down at the frozen world. The stars reflected in her eyes, cold and infinite. Yet she smiled faintly, touching the vial of moss she kept on her desk. "You'll live," she whispered. "You'll make the universe remember what warmth feels like." Then she turned away from the window, the faint glow of green light catching the edge of her reflection, a reminder that in the vast silence of space, One human heart had taught a dead planet to breathe again.